No, every once a month.
Once a month? Every couple months?
I write one a month.
I became that all.
10 a year. 10 once a month during the academic year. Well, I did just finish or published recently a new book called Spirituality in Action. So I might talk a little bit about that and give historic context for, again, my interest is in doing theology to figure out what difference it makes to us. It's like immediate response to revelation as to how it relates to daily life or what we read in the newspapers and all. So it's all my interest to make the faith relevant to daily life. How do you show whatever theologically makes a difference and how we live, how we understand the world. The problem I deal with in the book is that very often people in the church have not really felt or known the call to holiness. And very often what happened is we divorce prayer life, what happens at Mass liturgy, from our everyday life, from what happens at work and what happens in the family. The Second Vatican Council said that. Second Vatican Council, it's always a touchstone, right? 1962 to 65, produced 16 documents. You should know those. That's our touchstone. 16 documents those bishops produced back in the 60s. Doctrine like on liturgy, on the church, and the longest of all the 16 documents, and some would think the most important, is the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, often called Gaudium et Spes. The Latin church doctrine is always named after the first two Latin words in the Latin version of it. Gaudium et Spes, the joys and hopes of the world are our own joys and hopes. So, in that document, they said the split between life of faith, the religious life, the prayer life, and the ordinary life is among the worst errors of our time. It's one of the more serious errors. Whereas almost all church councils, there's been 21 church councils before. If you jump backwards, we had Second Vatican II. You go back before that was Vatican I, back in 1870. And you jump way back then to the Council of Trent in the 16th century, which was the response to the Protestant Reformation. Council of Trent. So you can see that in the last 5 centuries only had 3 councils. They don't happen real often, but you got 21 of them over the last centuries. So this is the 21st council. Almost all the previous councils were connected with some error, some heresy. Okay? So the Council of Nicaea was the first of the ecumenical councils in 325, was in response to the Arian heresy, which denied that Jesus Christ was truly God in one way or another. He was like a half-God. So councils have always been called to fight heresies. Somebody is not teaching correctly, and so they have a council, and the bishops get together, and they set boundaries. They call those dogmas. And the dogmas are there and say you have to believe this, or else you're not part of us anymore. You're out. If you don't believe a dogma, then you're a heretic. So if you don't believe that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, that he's consubstantial with the Father, the Council of Nicaea, we all know what they said, was they produced the Nicene Creed, as we say at Mass, the Nicene Creed, Nicaea. It actually comes from Constantinople also in 381, but that's a little nuanced. But anyway, so councils produce statements that are test cases to see if you're in route. We call those dogmas. If you don't, then you're a heretic. Now, what was unique and different about the Second Vatican Council was it wasn't called to combat any explicit dogmatic heresy. There wasn't any particular heresy that anyone was worried about at the time. Pope John the 23rd called it, as he said, have a new Pentecost, open the windows, he said, let in fresh air, and to deal with the practical problem of living as a Christian, Catholic Christian, in the 20th century. And when they looked at that, you're back to that same problem I'm talking about, the split. Split between the life of prayer and the life of action, between contemplation and activity, between liturgy and life, between how you pray and how you act at work. And that's the kind of split. Now, what that results in is the sense of people, when that split is at work, then Catholic lay people very often said, well, it's really the priests and the nuns who are to be the holy ones.
Make him sit in that corner. That's him.
They never apologize for being a parent.
He brought a nice book with him, and Catholic Study Bible.
That's the one we use for the
Formation process.
Good.
You can't find anything but the 1,000-page introduction.
That's very good. Okay, so I am on the problem that I am addressing. And I said the problem is split between liturgy and life. Now, it's helpful to, and I'm saying that's bad. I mean, you can say, well, so what? You got a split. Well, bad things happen when you got a split like that. One of the bad things that happen is that lay people who live most of their life here, they're not sitting around contemplating and reading their Bible all day long. They're working, raising families and earning a living and recreating. The problem is that Catholic lay people end up feeling like they're second class. Like the priests and nuns are called to holiness, but we're not. Main thing we got to do is sort of avoid sin and try to get to heaven. And but just in terms of being called to holiness, no, we don't really feel that. So you create, by that split, second-class citizenry. A lot of Christians who just think they're not called anything special, not called to sanctity or anything like that. The other bad thing that happens is that very often Catholics go about doing their ordinary daily things without ever thinking about, well, what does Christ think about that? Or what does my faith have to do with that? So people would go to work and do their job and have very little impact, what they believe in church, what they say in church, but the Bible says there's very little impact on that. The Bible's nice for prayer, but doesn't tell me much about how to be a pharmacist, or how to work in this factory, and how to raise my family. Doesn't say much about that. So bad things happen from this primary split that has occurred on time. Now, I want to help you see how that happened and how we ended up with that split. Now, this is just a bit petty, maybe, but we try to stay with me here. When the followers of Jesus were serious about it, the early followers wanted to be really good disciples. They wanted to be heroic. They wanted to stand up for the faith. And they had the opportunity to do that because there was something known as the Roman persecutions. Christians were persecuted. And so in the first 3 centuries, to be a really great Christian, the way you did it was you got to be a martyr. And you will read things. I mean, it's like St. Ignatius of Antioch. You read him, he longs to be a martyr. He can't wait to be taken. And this was the mentality of many of the Christians. They didn't want to be skipped over. They wanted to be apprehended and persecuted and thrown into the arena with the lions and all of that. They wanted to do that to prove that they were great, that they were heroic, that they really were dedicated to Jesus. And of course we know the church flourished on the martyrs. It was the blood of the martyrs that nourished the early church. So who were the heroes? They were the martyrs. When we talk about the great saints of the early church, they were the martyrs. They gave their life for the faith. Now, in the 4th century, along comes Constantine, and he ruins it all because he stops the persecution. He stops the persecution. Now what are you going to do? How the heck are you going to be heroic now? That was the problem facing the Christians. What were you going to do? And there was a fellow in Egypt who came up with an answer. St. Anthony of the Desert. And he said, well, the only thing you can do now is give up everything. Give up family and job and everything else you're doing and go out into the desert and pray. He was the first of the desert fathers. He's the founder of, in one sense or another, of monasticism. Monasticism means monasteries. Monasteries are where monks live. And so, in shorthand, what happened was monk replaced the martyr as the supreme example of how you are to live the Christian life. The new model of sanctity now was the monk. That is, the persons who went out into the desert, gave up everything and prayed, or the people in the Western church who went to monasteries and lived celibate lives and had a regular regimen for prayer, got up in the middle of the night to say matins and went through all of the prayers throughout the day. They had a strict regimen. There was time for examination of conscience. There was time for Bible reading. There was time for work. They had to work with your hands. Their motto was
To work with the pray.
Work and pray. That's right. Volare et laborare. That's right. Work and pray. Volare et laborare. That's right. Absolutely right. The first time I was in a city office building and looked up at the seal, the motto, it just was amazing to me. That is, Volare et laborare.
Well, you know what? Seems like you would have known that answer. But I was
You were too quick.
Well, it's so seldom that I know something. They understand this.
You really impressed all of us.
Well, you know what? I have to, on Labor Day at St. Rose, they hang that banner on the front of the. I'm sorry. Y'all can go back. You can go back and put your low expectations on my ability.
You can't look at that without looking at the back side.
He's on the back.
What's the back side?
Are you eating, Frank? You might be getting a new ball here pretty soon.
Yep, I remember when I first saw that, it just flabbergasted me to see that. So, you got the Benedict, so they had a regimen, and they followed it, and it was a whole structured approach, where the day was divided up carefully into times for prayer and times for work. It was a communal life. You went to the church and prayed the office together. It was the Benedictine spirituality. So the monk was set up as a model for sanctity now. Who were the holy people? They're not martyrs anymore. They're monks. Now that notion has really continued right up to our own time. The correlative of that, what flows from that is that if they're the great example of holiness, then these other people who don't have time to go to a monastery or who get married and have jobs somehow can't be holy. And it is amazing throughout Christian history how little is written about holiness for lay people, how marriage could be a path to coming closer to God, how work, job could make you a better person and a better Christian. Very little written in the whole history of Christianity. It's just simply amazing. In the Middle Ages, by and large, it was thought that the best thing that lay people could do, since they had so many temptations in the world, was avoid mortal sin. And we did that by making your Easter duty and praying regularly and so on. So that's one of the things that fed into this split. And which the Second Vatican Council said was among the more serious errors of our time. Fed into this split. Now, there was a second sort of thing that happened. This is probably a little more difficult to really get hold of, but let me try, and if it doesn't take, we'll just pass over it. But Greek philosophy was extremely important on the development of the understanding of what Christianity was all about. Now remember, Jesus was a Jew, right? His mother was a Jew. His father was a Jew. He lived his life as a Jewish man. He lived in a Jewish culture. The thought patterns of Jesus were shaped by the Hebrew Scriptures. He talked about himself in terms of the Hebrew Scriptures. He called himself the Son of Man. It's based on the book of Daniel. He thought of himself as the suffering servant. That's based on Isaiah. His followers thought of him as the son of David, the great Jewish king. He was thought of as the new Moses, the founding figure for Judaism. So on these high holy days in the Jewish world, it's nice to remember our Jewish roots. You can't really understand Jesus or Christianity without understanding the Jewish roots. Jesus was a Jew, Jewish man, Jewish layman. Okay, so the thought patterns of Christianity were created out of the Hebrew Scriptures and out of the Hebrew mentality. Now, that was good, and Paul had to take that and try to speak it to the Romans. The Romans got another culture, another outlook. So Paul had to take this to the Greek-speaking world and figure out how to frame the message for them. So he couldn't run around saying Jesus is the son of David and just making that the big thing, because the Romans are saying, well, who's David? Never heard of him. Who's the suffering servant? Never heard of him either. So, it wouldn't make any sense. You see, always Christianity has had to be presented in the terms of the culture in which the people live. So Paul had to begin to broaden it out. He talked about Jesus as the new Adam. Now they got a linkage. Now, the Romans can understand this. He's the father of all human race. Romans as well as Jews. So Paul sees Jesus as the new Adam. Through Adam, sin came into the world. Through Christ, we have grace. Okay? New Adam came. That's an example of adapting the Scriptures to the culture. Now, as time went on, Greek philosophy became more and more influential on Christian thinkers. And the key person here and the key city is Alexandria, Egypt. In Alexandria, Egypt, the philosophy, now this is technical and you can just get the main idea, but the philosophy of Plotinus was very important. It was heir of Plato and Aristotle and that whole line of thought, especially of Plato. Now, the thought pattern that they had is important because Plotinus felt, and all called the Neoplatonists, that you got to be a better person by distancing yourself from this material world. That the material world is fundamentally a problem, a temptation. It's something that took you away from God. And in order to get to God, which they call the One, the capital O, the One, you had to sort of go through stages of distancing yourself from the world, from sexuality, from job, from everything. You had to get away from all of that. See, for the Greeks, the good life, classic Greek culture of Plato and Aristotle, 3rd and 4th centuries before Jesus. Before Jesus now. Okay, 4th century before Jesus. Classic Greek culture thought that the good life was to sit around and philosophize. In other words, we're leading a good life now. This is the good life.
I agree.
Yeah.
I like this.
You like this, yeah.
No problem on me.
Well, we have to see there was a problem with it, though. Yeah. So the good life was to do philosophy, to sit around and to think. And, with Aristotle at least, to try to do politics. Politics was the other great, important, marvelous thing to do. The word politics comes from the Greek word polis, like Minneapolis, means city, just to take care of the city, the polis. Right? So, and the reason you wanted to order the city properly was so that more people could sit around and philosophize.
What did they think about who's going to provide for them?
There you go. That is the problem. The way they handled that was through slave labor. Slave labor and women. Women looked at it as property. So they were going to do that, and that's how it worked. It was set up on a slave labor system. So the reason you could sit around and philosophize is because slaves were doing all of the work. They didn't even like the artisans. That is the craftsmen who were making wooden objects and so on. You know, carpenters and people like that. They looked down on them too. Because they were dealing with this kind of thing. They wanted to deal with universal truth. You know, the highest realm, speculation, theory, universal truth, not how do you make a good table. So now you begin to see the problem that comes in Greek philosophy. Split. Right, you have the life of the spirit, the life of the soul, the life of the mind, split off from this world, from practically. The slaves did the labor, the women did all the domestic chores, the craftsmen made what you needed, so that we, the male, educated elite, could sit around and speculate, do philosophy, think.
Did they ever figure out how they were chosen to be that particular?
Well, there were a lot of theories of that. Plato offered theories of that felt there were certain people sort of prepared by birth to be part of this. That also there were people who could be educated towards it. The women were ruled out immediately, so half the population was gone. For the Romans, who adopted the same sort of principle as well, that culture was built on slave labor, there was the possibility for the slaves to move, to get out of slavery, to buy their way out, to educate their way out, and to become part of this more elite male grouping. Male slaves could do that. With the Greeks, there wasn't much chance for movement like that. And Plato, of course, had the whole idea that the epitome of this was the philosopher king. Philosopher, the best of all these thinkers, we would make the king, because then he would be able to govern and set the polis, the politics, as it should be. It was Greek culture was static that way. You were born into it, and that's the way it stayed. Now, this whole line of thought came into the Christian world through the city of Alexandria, where there were thought is Origen. Origen died in 254. Origen bought into this thing. Okay? Origen took the Platonic philosophy, especially through Plotinus, and said what we've got to do is escape from the world, escape from bodliness, make this ascent, spiritual ascent, get more and more holy, closer and closer to God. Common story is that Origen, to sort of effect this and symbolize that, castrated himself. And that was not a totally uncommon thing to do, because that was the way of part of the steps of distancing oneself from ordinary sexuality, from life in the world, and so on. Now that thought came into Christian thought in general. See, what happens always, and we continue today, is that the reigning philosophy or the generalizing the culture are used to explain faith. Can't be any other way. Now that happens. You use language. If I'm going to preach to collegians, I got to talk about words that they know, or anyone. And we use our own things. So they began to use these Greek words and the Greek approaches to things. Now, here's an example. Origen interpreted the story of Mary and Martha. Remember that one? What, Martha's doing a lot of things. She's working, doing all the ordinary stuff. And Mary is sitting listening. Right? And Jesus said, Mary's chosen the better part. Right? Now, Origen takes that and interprets it and says what that means is that these monks in the monastery, these nuns in the convent, are like Mary. They're the higher way. They're the contemplative way. They have followed the higher path. So that Jesus himself has justified this distinction. It's Jesus himself who said that the contemplative way is the higher way, that the monks are holier than married people, etc. Right? Now that interpretation of Origen was, as I said, one of the 5, let's say, most influential thinkers in the history of the church. Origen, who died in 254, and then just to play out that list, clearly St. Augustine, who died in 430, clearly St. Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274, and the other person who might not be so clear to you is St. Bonaventure, who lived the same time Thomas Aquinas did. He was a Franciscan. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. And then David Tracy would say the next great and most influential one was my own teacher, Karl Rahner, in the 20th century. So in the Catholic world, now if we were going to include Protestants, we'd have to add some people here, but let's just stay with that for a while. That is the influential thinkers. Now the influential thinkers are influential because they found a whole school of thought, because they give a whole new way of doing theology, because they give a whole new interpretation of how to see the faith. And that's what each one of these great thinkers did. And then others read what they say and they follow it and they form a school of thought. So we have an Augustinian school of thought. Out of all those 5, no doubt the most influential of all is St. Augustine, who died in 430. As someone said, all theology is nothing but a footnote to Augustine. It's all playing out. What Augustine thought and said is just continues to be a part of our own outlook and way of thinking and so on. So the point is here that Origen interpreted that story as saying that monks are better than lay people, holier. And this whole philosophy said the way you get holy is move up the ladder, get away from the world, get away from sexuality, get away from family life, get closer to God that way. So what I told, yes?
How did they relate that to the idea that created by God with these facilities that we have, How could they be wrong?
That's a very good point. You probably could look at Augustine to see this most clearly. Augustine, his personal history, Augustine is the one who influences our thoughts on sexuality more than any other single person. Now, the history of Augustine, as you might know, is he had all kinds of problems with his mother Monica, left home, and began living with this woman, and had an illegitimate son. I suppose you'd think of it like a common law marriage. Had his son Adeodatus, and so on. Augustine saw, and then eventually was converted, as you know, and he left this woman, and he took up with another woman in between that, and then eventually was converted, and then became a bishop, and wrote the Confessions, and City of God, and all this stuff that influenced that. Now, Augustine's viewpoint was that God gave the sexual drive for one reason. That's to propagate the human race. So, that was the reason. All the other, Augustine had very little sense of sexuality as being a method of showing love, of fostering union. Also, in fact, the classic statement is that Augustine thought that for married couples, to have intercourse and not intend to have children would be at least a venial sin. That's a way of getting hold of how Augustine saw it. Now, Augustine is a complex figure, and he is the richest thinker in our history, and he's always got, if I say one thing, you can find in a book where he said something else. It sounds different. So no pygmy should shoot at the giant. Human sexuality. So to carry on. Now, that has influenced us ever since. That was one of the great significances of the Second Vatican Council. That the Second Vatican Council took another position on that absolutely crucial question. And essentially, the Council would say there's two reasons for human sexuality. One is to produce children. The other is to foster mutual love. See, so Augustine ruled, in some ways, Augustine's thought carried the day all through. So that, and it's all the idea that the world is somehow not right, and so on. Now, your point, well taken, that one-sided point, that all history does not make a lot of sense in terms of other things. There's a whole other tradition that seems very different. And I want to go through that and say where the counterpoint is throughout the tradition. But the answer to the question, well, how did we get this, where there's this big divide between what goes on in church and what goes on in the world? Why is it that so many people do not see the bedroom as a place to encounter the Lord? Why is it that very few people see their work as making them holier? Why is it that so few people see involvement in civic life today as somehow being part of the Christian obligation? Why is it? I'll give you two reasons. Right? The monk replaced the martyr as the supreme model of what it meant to be really good, heroic, strong, faithful disciple, and that carried through. And secondly, Greek philosophy gave us a very poor notion of the world, of manual labor. Just think of that. It's a total look down on manual labor. Manual labor is something done by slaves and women. So you look down on manual labor, looking down on sexuality, looking down on the world. And that strain has been all the way through. See, Augustine bought Origen's explanation of Mary and Martha's story. He thought it was the same thing. Pope Gregory the Great in 600 bought that story too, interpreted the same way. That Mary, Jesus was saying, being a monk is better than being a housewife. Okay, so now, what you see, and stop me anytime, okay? Because I'll just ramble on forever.
Or counsel. We'll listen. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Origen, you say he's one of the five fathers, like fathers of the
No, I
church?
don't say, well, the word fathers is a technical word that describes all of the early thinkers, like St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and there's a whole bunch of fathers of the church. They're the people from the early centuries who have tremendous influence, so they are much broader. I'm saying out of all of the thinkers, all the theologians in the history of the church, there's a handful that have just made a tremendous difference in the way everybody thought about Christianity. It's not like they're in a university and no one ever heard of them and who cares. No, these are people who made a difference. I mean, they changed the way everybody thought about Christianity. The way everybody interpreted it.
Okay, so is Origen, is he a Greek philosopher?
Yes, he's from Alexandria. No, he was a Christian, but he learned Greek philosophy. So he wrote these wonderful commentaries on the Song of Songs. He was a priest. He eventually left Alexandria and went taught elsewhere. He was persecuted. His father was killed for being a Christian. But then, he wasn't martyred, and so he again needed this other way to try to be holy and good. So he is an Eastern father. When we talk about fathers, we divide East and West. Augustine is a great Western father. He was from Carthage and spent time in Rome, so he's a Western father of the church. Origen and Cyril of Alexandria, Cyril of Jerusalem, and St. Basil the Great, those are all Eastern fathers. That's how it's divided. Eastern Roman Empire, East and West. These are the Eastern fathers, Western fathers. Now, this is also helpful to remember. The Eastern Church has always seen things differently than we in the West do. One of the theologians used this image, and our Pope likes to use it. He says, we in the West have been breathing out of only one lung all these years. That's the Western lung. So we've only known Augustine and Aquinas, we've only known our Western way of doing it, our Latin rite, and so on. We haven't known the Eastern world. We haven't known what and the Eastern fathers and Eastern theology generally has been quite different. They have their own rites, as you know. They have their own religion. They have married clergy. They don't understand this idea of priests not being able to get married. And these are people in union of Rome. Remember, these are good Catholics, as good as anybody sitting in the room. They have 7 sacraments, they have bishops. They're under the authority of the Pope. But they're Eastern, and they're different. And one of the ways they're different is, and this is, people like Origen had this tremendous idea of grace. Grace for them was God's presence in us that divinized us, made us God. St. Basil says in her office, we read our breviary. It's in the end of one of the articles that are written by St. Basil the Great says, and we become God. Now, we in the West, pantheism. Right? Pantheism. Everybody's got, not all God, what is this? In the East, they didn't get excited about it. They thought grace divinized us. Grace just took us over. Grace transformed us. Grace made us sons and daughters of God. In the West, grace was seen a little differently. It became something like you had that you didn't want to lose, so you could get to heaven. Now that's a caricature, and that's how it came down though to people in the Catholic world in the 20th century. Grace was something you had, and you got it by going to the sacraments. You could lose it by mortal sin, and you better have it when you die, or you weren't getting through the pearly gates to be in heaven. Don't lose grace. See, so grace took on a more objective kind of character in the West. In the East, it had much more of a relational sense. What's happened in the 20th century, so he says, my teacher, Karl Rahner, is, what Rahner did was go back and reread the Eastern Fathers, like Origen and so on, and say, my heaven, this is interesting, and brought it more into the Western thinking. But the Pope says, our problem is we've been breathing through one lung. We've known the Western Fathers, like Augustine. We've not known the Eastern Fathers, like Origen. And if we knew more about them, we'd have much more of a feeling for the Holy Spirit. See, in the East, the Holy Spirit's been really important to them. You got Western Catholics who pray to God through Jesus and never think of the Spirit. The Spirit has not played a major role in our piety. In the East, they don't understand that. In the East, the Holy Spirit is crucial to this whole thing. They don't understand because the Spirit, we're temples of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is what divinizes us.
So did they have a renew charismatic experience in the Eastern Church, or was it there all along?
No long.
It just came down to it.
Yes, the split occurred right in the beginning because of the cultural thing. When Christianity went west and to Rome, different way of thinking, different outlook influenced it. When it stayed in the East, different thought patterns. So right from the beginning, the East and West began to diverge in the way they thought about things. Okay? And then at times, eventually, it became really a split. And you got in 1054, you got the real official split between the Orthodox Christians, like Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, all of that, and the Roman Catholics. 1054, they both communicated with each other. So it split 1,000 years, deep and wide, and they weren't ways and so on. But some of these people, the Orthodox, don't accept Pope. You also have Eastern people over here who do accept the Pope. We all often call them unions. They're unions with Rome. And they got married priests, they got 2-hour Eucharist, they got a lot of incense, a lot of chanting. They got different ways than we have. Okay, so that was an answer to a question about Origen.
Okay.
Origen being an Eastern father, but not the only Eastern father.
Well, actually, I didn't even get my question out.
The premise I had asked before you got it out.
Well, I just wanted to know if Origen was, if he died in 254, well, then he really didn't, he didn't have any personal connections with Plato because he was...
Oh, Plato was way before.
Way gone.
But Plotinus, see, it comes down to Plotinus, it was 4th century BC, and Aristotle, we had Socrates, teacher of Plato, teacher of Aristotle. That's a very classic period of Greek philosophy. But they developed a school of thought known as Neo-Platonism. That is, the followers of Plato especially, and followers of Plato, one of whom was Plotinus. Plotinus was a 3rd century figure, got into the 3rd century, and he was in Alexandria, and that's where Origen was. And Origen picked up his ideas and said, we can put those into a synthesis. So he makes a new synthesis of Christianity about. What do we need? The full list.
Now, where is the Rome is the western city?
That's right.
The big eastern city.
Alexandria, it was an intellectual center in the East. Of course, Jerusalem was always important in the East.
Where is Alexandria? Yeah, here.
Egypt.
Okay.
Alexandria in Egypt.
I don't know anything North Army River.
Alexandria is in Egypt, so that's what it's doing. Okay? So it's on the whole thing of saying now that, as Mel was saying, that, how is it this way? Well, I'll highlight it for you, to show you, this is the way of looking at it. This development is extremely strange. Because all these people are followers of Jesus. Now you think of who Jesus was. Now Jesus had the option of becoming a monk. there was a group known as the Essenes, living by the Dead Sea. We got the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, they found the documents from this monastic community. They lived like monks. They were celibates, lived in community like monks do. Jesus chose not to be an Essene. He could have become an Essene. He could have. Some people think that maybe John the Baptist was an Essene. I mean, I don't think he was, but they would think that because John lived such an ascetical life and was out there in the desert and ate grasshoppers and all of that, wore rough clothes and so on, that maybe he was an ascetic like the Essenes. But the point is, Jesus was not an Essene. He chose to be active in the world. Didn't go to a monastery. He was a carpenter. He wasn't the son of a carpenter. He was the son of a carpenter, but he was also a carpenter. And Matthew says Jesus was the son of the carpenter, but Mark says he was a carpenter.
Well, doesn't that go back and give the people a problem who felt that to work with hands?
Well, of course.
And Jesus himself
worked with his hands. There's no way, that element of Greek thought has always been suspect in Christian circles. The Greeks didn't like the manual labor, but I would say that in Christian thought we've never really gotten totally away from the fact that Jesus is a carpenter. So Christians modified that element of Greek thought. Christians did not really think we should have slaves to buttress this thing. They didn't think we should have manual labor was bad. So they didn't buy all of it. They always Christianized it in some way. So here's Jesus. No, he's not in the scene, but he's active in the world. And yet we walk around saying monks are better than people in the world. And the other thing, to remember that Jesus was not a priest. Jesus was a layman in his culture. He could have become a priest, could have went to rabbi school, could have prepared himself to go in the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and offer sacrifice, like John the Baptist's father did, Zechariah. He was a priest. Zechariah is a priest. But Jesus chose not to do that. Now here's the paradox of history. The followers of a guy who refused to become a monk, remained a layperson in the world, and was not a priest, ended up thinking that priests are holier than lay people, and that monks are holier than anyone active in the world. It's very strange.
So they would have put themselves above Jesus.
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed. Very strange. And yet that is what has happened. It's one of the great paradoxes in Christian history. Now, of course, what is happening in our own time is that we're trying to rethink this thing. We're trying to do what the Second Vatican Council said, overcome that split. That's why I wrote this book, to help figure out how to overcome this split, so that people will find the Lord in the bedroom, and so in the kitchen, and in the factory, and in the office, and on the golf course, and at the bridge table, wherever human activity goes on, so that those things can become revelatory for us. Now, my teacher, Karl Rahner, is one of the great voices to try to overcome this split. That's part of Rahner's whole outlook on life. And he, again, along with Origen, Augustine, Aquinas, Bonaventure, Rahner, become really influential people. They set a whole new way of understanding what Christianity is all about. And Rahner has done that in our own century. Yes.
How old was Rahner? When did he die?
He died in 1984.
Oh, you knew him?
Oh, yes. I spent time with Rahner. I studied with him. He was my teacher informally. Yeah, Rahner died in 1984. He was born in 1904. And was a Jesuit, a Brother Hugo was also a Jesuit. Ronner was a tremendous man. Yes, I spent time with him in Munich. He was like an old shoe in his house where he lived. He was just as ordinary as can be. He didn't like to be around people who sort of were elitists or put on airs. He never wanted to be the center of attention. He didn't like it when I sat next to him for meals, because I would want to ask him theology questions and he wouldn't be the center of conversation. He wouldn't be sitting there like this expounding like I am right now. He wouldn't do that. He was a very humble man, and he was a very ordinary man. It was often said when he went to new cities, he didn't want to go to the churches or cathedrals. He wanted to go to the department stores. I took a walk with him one time, and we stopped in a little place, a coffee shop sort of thing, and all of his questions were about, well, how do you fix the food? How do you serve it? How do you take care of the people? He was extremely down to earth. And he believed that he wrote these wonderful things about finding God in humor, or in sleep, or in walking about, or in sitting down, all in work, all these ordinary kinds of things. Ronner believed that there were ways to see the presence of God, and that's the way we lived out our own holiness. So there was a secular holiness, a universal call to holiness. Ronner was extremely influential on the Second Vatican Council. He started writing about this stuff long before, back in the 30s and the 40s. And the fruit of his theological work became evident in the Second Vatican Council. And a lot of his ideas worked its way into that council. So I once told Ronner how influential he was in the United States. He said, oh, I don't think so.
How did you meet up with him ever, though? I mean, what made you went over there to see him? Or?
Well, that's a very conscious story. The long story is that I was teaching at Bowling Green, and I was teaching at State University and teaching a course called Belief and Unbelief with a brilliant expert on 19th and 20th century intellectual history who was an agnostic or an atheist. And I'm in this classroom with these impressionable young people trying to uphold faith and belief. And I'm sitting there saying, I got to be able to hold my own here. I have to know what I'm talking about. I can't let down these Christian students in here. And so that was part of the catalyst for beginning to think I got to know more. So I began to experiment with different Catholic theologians in my studies and reading and classes, and to see which one would resonate most with me and which one would help me best to hold my own and to preach better to the students and all of that. So I experimented with a lot of them, and eventually I decided that Ronner was the one I wanted to spend more time with. So at that point I went to Munich, Germany. And I spent time in a little town up north called Osnabrück. And I studied German for 2 weeks. And after I studied German for 2 weeks, I called Ralph on the phone using nobody else now, and asked him if he could come in. I remember 4 words that he said over the phone. I got the date right, and I got this day right, and so all that when he would see me. And I 4 other words: kind English, you're not going to speak English, and longer, not long, I'm not going to talk. I got on a train, went down to meet Ronner, the great Ronner, and introduced him, and I said, to write something about you. And Ronner said to me, things are as the sand seashore, not very inviting. And Ronner was not very impressed with German.
3
2 weeks
like
worth.
that.
Yeah, 3 weeks.
And so he says to me, you must bring a dolmetcher, an interpreter, and he's going to talk with me. Well, I was there not to, I was there to get a measure of the man. I knew I liked his thought, but I wanted to know who he was. I wanted to know what made him tick, and whether I could trust what I was reading, what he said, whether it was authentic or not. So I didn't want to interpret it. So I went in the room and he said, where's the dolmetcher? Where's the interpreter? I don't have one. Doesn't matter now. I started yelling. Where's the dolmetcher? Get the dolmetcher. I'm not going to. I want to talk to you. So finally he was all mad. He said, oh, Sesame, sit down. So we began to talk, and we talked in German for a while, and then we talked in Latin to one another, and then he didn't like my German, and he didn't like my Latin. And so we eventually began speaking English. You will meet friends of Ronner today who will tell you that Carl Ronner could not speak English. I know differently. Because he thought his English was better than my German, so he would speak English. So that's how I met him, and we talked, and after about 40 minutes, I said, Father Michelanga, I better go, not long. You stay. We talked to an hour and 20 minutes. At the end of that time, he got up and he put his arm around me, and he says, I want you to pray for my happy death.
And how old was he at the time?
He was about 77.
And what year was that?
That was in the late 70s, I think, when I first saw him. Well, then, yes, and at that point, after I just loved him, I knew we would get along. When he was sitting there yelling at me, I said, no problem. He reminded me so much of my own father. Just my own father. And I could see through it. I saw through it. It's all just a walk out stuff and all. I didn't bother. Just like my dad. I saw it underneath the goodness, the good, holy man. And so that was, then I decided, yes, I would write about him, and then that's when I went to Oxford and did my doctorate there. And then while I was at Oxford, I went and lived for a couple weeks in Munich, and that's when I spent time with Ron and so on. And I would see him, and he would help me with my writing and so on, what I was doing. So it was a great shaping experience of my life. And so I always think of my own mission is to take what I learn, share it. Here, that's why I'm here. That's part of my dedication is to say what I learned from him, I pass on to whoever I can. And I use his thought constantly, all my homilies, all my talks, everything I do, all my counseling, and he visited the sick and so on. It's all built right around that. Because I think that Ronner had a way of overcoming the split. He understood how to do that, and how to get those two things back together. And it's very, one sense it's extremely simple, in another sense it would be hard to get all the elements in place. But that is how we get to this point, and to say that we can overcome it, we need a way to overcome that split that says some elements like this, that we humans move and live and swim in one grace world. It's not like the monastery is a holier place than the kitchen. God's grace is everywhere. We live and move in one grace world. And everything in this world is potentially revelatory. All the words are important, are potentially revelatory. That means everything about human life can speak to us to God, about God, can bring us closer to God. Everything. It doesn't matter. The sunshine and the rain. Our good days and our bad days. Our virtues and our vices. It doesn't matter. All things human have the potential to remind us and put us in touch with God's presence. So that was one of the ways that Ronner tried to overcome this split. What Ronner said is this, that the means, how am I going to put it this way, put it negatively, no state of life, Ronner said, is essentially better than any other one. It's not essentially better to be a doctor than to be a nurse. No, it's not essentially better to be male or female. It's not essentially better to be a monk than to be a married woman. It's not. What counts in life is charity, is living the life of love of God and love of neighbor. What counts is to be close to God. And it is the question, what brings you closer to God? So you could go to a monastery and go through all that regimen and become a bitter person, a frustrated person. It doesn't have anything to do with holiness. The question is, does whatever you choose to do in life bring you closer to God or not? Is it a catalyst for growth? That is the question.
Did this turn some people off?
What Ronner was about?
Yeah.
Well, surprisingly little of that. Ronner did run into trouble right before the Second Vatican Council for the first time in the late 50s. Remember, the council began in 62. The preparatory work began in 60 or before. So in the late 50s, Ronner was issued sort of a warning by Rome about some things that he wrote about concelebration of Mass. Ronner, just as a sidelight now to get back to your point, but Ronner changed the practice of clergy in the Western world all over. When I was first ordained a priest, if there were 3-4 priests of us, we went together on vacation, I can remember doing this, we all celebrated separate masses. There's so many masses during the day, we didn't have time to play golf. And people here can remember when on All Souls Day we would try to have 3 masses, and I would say them as fast as I could say them in block, and come out and try to get through 3 of them as fast as I could get through at the time that ordinarily would take 1. Ronner said, none of that makes sense. This makes sense. It's simple. He said, don't more beast by more. You get great and more. Come out 3 masses and you're not thinking about what you're doing, and you just rush through them. It doesn't do any good. It doesn't make you holier. Why didn't say 1 mass?